Now I want to talk about the Bible, okay? Because the Bible is the mythology. It's a collective memory of the Israelites, okay? And so I'm going to discuss why the Bible was first created in this class. And what I will explain to you is the Bible was first created in order to explain and justify and create legitimacy for David. Okay? This is what we call an apology. And this is a very common practice. The idea is this. Most kings, every king, obtains power through really nefarious means. Okay? They either kill a lot of people to obtain power, or maybe the younger brother kills the older brother to usurp the throne. Okay? Usually kingship requires ruthlessness. But the problem is, when you're ruthless, you have a legitimacy problem, right? So the way that most kings resolve this issue is by sponsoring writings or an apology to explain why he or she is king. And the answer usually is, because God willed it so. Because I had no choice in the matter. I'm not ambitious. I was not at all ambitious. But the circumstances forced my hand. To save my people, to do God's work, I had to kill my brother. I had to kill my enemies. Even though I myself am not a violent person. Okay? That's usually how the apology goes. Okay? So remember, back at this point, the very idea of writing, it is new, it's a new technology, but it's also a very expensive technology, meaning you need to buy the materials, okay, which are rare, but you also need the people to be able to write, okay, and they're also very expensive. And you basically needed to be able to support a team of scribes to create any work of fiction. So writing back then is like movie making today. Okay, it's a very expensive endeavor that was usually sponsored by the king in order to justify or explain why he is king, in order to create legitimacy. Okay? Does that make sense? So the Bible was created first as an apology for David and explains why the house of David is now in charge of Israel. But as we discussed, okay, eventually the house of David, Israel, divides into two nations. Now the house of David, the Bible, goes with the house Judah, okay, to Judah. But the northern kingdom now needs its own mythology, its own Bible, right? And so a second Bible was created. The people who are in charge of the Bible, the priest class, are interested in promoting their own interests, mainly in the importance of ritual. It doesn't make sense? Like, what are rituals? Why do we need them? Why are priests important? Then you have people at this point in the Babylonian captivity looking back at the history of Israel and trying to figure out why the house of David collapsed. And their answer is because the Israelites refused to follow the will of God. Because the Israelites became polytheistic or they became immoral, okay? Does that make sense? In other words, the Bible at this point are divided into like 4 major factions or schools. Okay? The school that supports the house of David, the legitimacy of the house of David is called the J school. Okay? The J school. Don't worry about this. I'll explain to you next class what these things mean. The people who support the northern kingdom as legitimate house of Israel is called the E school. E. The school that supports the power of the priests are obviously called the P school, okay, for priests. And then the school that tries to go back in history and examine why Israel fell, and which believe it's because the Israelites betrayed God. These people are what we call the D school. Okay? The D school. So E, G, P, and D. And these are just 4 of the major schools. There are other schools as well. All right? And so at this point, the Bible is divided into like 4 major schools or documents controlled by different factions. When the Persians take over, okay, they insisted, you need one religion, guys. You need one document. And so all 4 were put together to create the Bible. But the way they did it was very interesting. All they did was just put them together, okay? Do you understand? So if you read the Bible, it's like A, B, C, D. A, B, C, D. Okay? So one line is from the E school, the next line is from the J school, the other line is from the P school. It's very confusing to read. If you don't understand this history, it is impossible for you to read the Bible. I'm not sure if you've tried to read the Bible, it's not readable. Okay? So why would they do this? Why would they just put all 4 texts together without major editing or revisions? Why? Do you guys know? Why would they do that? They just made a complete mess of the Bible. But why would they do that? Okay, so let me explain. The first major reason is most people didn't read or write back then. So the Bible itself didn't really matter. What mattered was the oral explanation of the Bible controlled by the priest class. Does it make sense? The people didn't read the Bible. So how the Bible was actually written was not that important. It was important for the priests to have access to the Bible, okay, but the people didn't actually read the Bible. That's the first reason. The second, more important reason is because the Bible is political real estate. And I want you to remember this idea, okay? It is the most valuable political real estate in the world. Everyone wants to be in the Bible because to be in the Bible gives you legitimacy. It gives you power, right? So, if you're a king and you have 4 sons who all want to be king, well, your best solution is to divide the kingdom among the 4 sons, right? Same with the Bible. You have 4 extremely powerful schools and political factions. So the best way to resolve the issue is just to say, listen, we'll put you all in the Bible together, okay? And when you merge them, it's a lot easier than if you just try to do it by order, okay? Like E school goes first, and J school, then P school, then D school, okay? They just put them all together. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is a very important idea. The Bible is the most valuable political real estate in the world. Everyone wants to be in there. And what ideas you can find in there will ultimately shape human history. Okay? Any questions so far before I continue? All right. So the last thing I want to talk about today is the Apology of David, which is the beginning of the Bible. Okay. So when kings come to power, they have 3 major problems, right? The first major problem is legitimacy. What gives you the right to be king? Okay. Second problem is the idea of identity. And this is a huge problem for the Israelites because the Israelites is a multicultural entity. You have people speaking different languages, different cultures. They practice different cultures, they practice different religions. So now you need to create an identity that everyone accepts. Okay? The third thing is differentiation. You need not only for these people to get along, but you need to get them to divorce their former culture. Does that make sense? Because you have Egyptian priests in there. And you have to tell these Egyptian priests, you are now Israelites and you're not Egyptian anymore. Okay? And the example that we use for this is Augustus Caesar and the writing of the Ennead. Okay? Remember, the Ennead, it's a book about a character named Aeneas. And it provides political legitimacy to Augustus Caesar because Augustus Caesar is a direct descendant of Aeneas, who is the founder of Rome. Also, what the Ennead said is Augustus Caesar is the end point of Roman history. Everything before Augustus Caesar led to him. Augustus Caesar is like the Jesus of Rome, okay? He is the salvation, he is the redemption of Rome. Okay, that's what the Ennead does, okay? Second thing about the Ennead is it creates a new Roman identity that focuses on piety, loyalty over liberty. Remember the problem for Augustus Caesar was Romans didn't like kings. Well, now he's a king. So how do you get people to obey? Well, you tell them piety is more important than liberty. All right? The third idea is the Ennead, remember, it's anti-Greek. The problem for Rome at that time was Greek culture was vastly superior to Roman culture. And so a lot of Romans were adopting Greek cultural practice like Mark Antony. And so the Ennead said, Greek culture is like the Trojan horse. If you let into your city, Greek culture will corrupt you and destroy you. Okay? So, guess what, guys? Every king has to resolve all three issues, okay? Legitimacy, identity, and differentiation. And that's what David is trying to do with the Bible. Okay, so I'll give you three examples, three stories from the Bible that illustrate David's quest for legitimacy. Next class, we'll talk about identity and differentiation and how the Bible achieves that, okay? But for this class, I want to focus on legitimacy. So, now that David is king, a lot of people don't think he's legitimate. Why? Because he ruthlessly tried to usurp the throne from Saul, right? Saul is the king that everyone picked or elected. And he was a good king. He was good at war. He was someone that most people liked. And David stole the throne from him, okay? So now, what is David's problem, now that he has a throne? Others will try to steal it from him, right? You understand? Because if you, David, if you set the president, if you steal the throne, then others are now empowered to steal the throne from you as well. Okay? So the first thing the Bible does, the apology for David does, is show us David loved Saul. He was not at all ambitious. He cared only for the well-being of his king. Okay? And so one story that illustrates this, there are actually many, many stories in the Bible that does this, but one story that illustrates this is this. So Saul thinks David's trying to kill him. So he's chasing after David with his army, okay, trying to kill David and his followers. One day, Saul is alone in a cave, praying to God for deliverance. David sees Saul alone, and he sneaks up behind Saul. Then he takes his sword and cuts a piece of Saul's clothing. Okay? And then David disappears. Saul leaves the cave, and then David rushes to him and says, Saul, my king, I beg of you, give me a second. Let me explain to you. Back then in the cave, I could have killed you. This is a piece of clothing to prove I could have killed you. But I didn't, because I love you, because I'm loyal to you. I would never kill you. And then Saul says, oh, this is proof that you never meant to kill me. Okay? And this is a story in the Bible. Obviously, this story cannot be true, okay? But this is what the Bible is trying to do. It's trying to first show us that David is not all ambitious. In fact, the entire apology of David is focused on the lack of ambition of David. Okay? So that's the first story. Let's look at the second story. Okay? The second story is this. Saul is dead, and his son, who's a young man, comes into the throne. There's a general named Abner, okay, Abner, who was loyal to Saul, but now that Saul is dead and David is very popular among the people, Abner sees the political winds changing, and Abner tries to align himself with David. So Abner writes a long letter to David and saying, listen, I will swear loyalty to you, and will end the civil war between the house of Saul and the house of David. You will unite Israel. And then David writes back and says, yeah, come to me. I'll give you a feast, and then we'll be friends. And so Abner comes, David gives him a feast. And then as Abner leaves, he runs into David's general named Joab. And Joab and Abner go a long way back, okay? They were friends, they were enemies. Abner killed Joab's brother. And in an act of anger, Joab stabs Abner to death, okay, and Abner is dead. And once Abner is dead, the house of Saul basically gives up, and David is able to unite Israel. Okay, now that's the story in the Bible. David is so angry by this that he curses Joab, and he gives Abner a great funeral. Right? Because David does not want to betray his friends. Why is this story wrong or completely made up? It's not made up, but it's what we call spin, right? Clearly, Abner and David had a feast together, and clearly Joab killed Abner. But why is the Bible version of this event wrong or incorrect? It can't be true. You guys know? Okay, this is hard, okay? But the reason is this. If you're David and you're king, which person in the world are you most afraid of? If you're the king, there's a person in this world you're most afraid of, or you're most suspicious of. Who is that person? Abner. Okay, yeah, he is suspicious of Abner. But in general, you should be suspicious of Joab, right? Because Joab has access to your army. Abner is your enemy, but Joab has access to your army. So if Joab wants to betray you, he could. Okay? So in other words, because David is most suspicious of Joab, if Joab were ever to act independently, then David would need to kill him. Does that make sense? And in this circumstance, Joab acted independently. David told Joab Abner was an honored guest. And Joab didn't care. He was angry about the death of his brother, and he kills Abner. This cannot possibly be true. You understand? Joab had to kill Abner because he was ordered to by David. Right? Now why would David want Abner to be killed? Because in his mind he thinks, oh, if Abner can betray the house of Saul, he can also betray the house of David. He is an ambitious man. And why would he think like that? Why would David come to this conclusion? Because he himself is like that. Do you understand? He himself betrayed Saul. So he's very, very careful or cautious about people who betray their leaders. Right? Abner betrayed the house of Saul, and it was very likely that he would betray David at some point as well. And so David had to have him killed. Right? But he could not say this publicly. Because if you were to say this publicly, then it would show he, in fact, knew this because he betrayed Saul. Does that make sense? The logic of this? Okay? But you can see how wonderful the spin is. It's almost impossible to see the truth from this, right? If you're a person, you know, okay, David, and you know that Joab killed Abner, and you were told the story, you would believe the story. It's just because Abner was angry. that he killed, it was just because Joab was angry, he killed Abner. Okay, you believe that, right? But you think about it, it can't be true, okay? Now, I'm going to give you one more story. And this story is actually even harder to figure out because of the spin. Okay? Now that David is king of Israel, Israel has many enemies. So his armies are always at war. Okay? One day, David is on the rooftop of his house. So, and Israel's not a very rich place, okay? So these are not palaces, they're just houses, okay? And so David is strolling on his rooftop, and across from him is a woman named Bathsheba. And she's bathing naked. And David is overcome with lust. He's like, I must have this woman, okay? And he's king. He orders his servant to go get her. She comes, they have sex, okay? The problem is, we have sex, but she gets pregnant, okay? The problem now is, Bathsheba's married to a man named Uriah, the Hittite. And Uriah the Hittite is one of David's best soldiers, and he's fighting for David and Israel somewhere else. So David's like, oh, this is a problem because once Uriah comes home and he finds Bathsheba has a new child, he's going to know it's not his. So either he's going to kill her or he's going to figure out it's David to come kill him. Okay? So David, being very clever, has a solution to this. He invites Uriah back home. Okay? So Uriah comes home from the war, and Uriah thinks, oh, the king has called for me. Therefore, it's an emergency. Okay? So he rushes back, and David meets Uriah at his house, and David says, listen, Uriah, you've been doing such a great job. You're such a great soldier. You're so loyal. I want to give you a vacation. Go home and be with your wife. And Uriah's like, my king, my comrades are dying. They're starving out in the battlefield. I cannot abandon them. How can I find pleasure in my wife when my friends are suffering? I refuse to go home. I will not go home until the battle is won. And David tries his best, but he can't convince Uriah to go home. So then David tells Uriah, you're such a great soldier, you're so loyal, I'm so happy and proud that you fight for me. And he gives Uriah a letter to his general, Joab, okay? And the letter instructs Joab to kill Uriah. Joab will send Uriah with his soldiers out in the battlefield. And then at the last minute, Joab will recall his soldiers, leaving Joab by himself. At this point, the enemies will swarm Uriah and kill Uriah. Okay? And that's what happens. And once Uriah is dead, David marries Bathsheba. And they're about to have a child together. At this point, David is visited by a prophet named Nathan. And Nathan says to David, I want to ask you a question. And David says, sure, go ahead. Nathan says, let's imagine there are two shepherds. There's a rich shepherd with 100 sheep, and there's a poor shepherd with 2 sheep. There's a traveler, a foreign guest, who comes into town, and the rich shepherd wants to honor him with a feast. The rich shepherd steals the poor man's shepherd to feed the traveler. Who's in the wrong? And David says, of course the rich shepherd is in the wrong. He's indignant. He's angry. How could a man be so unrighteous as to steal another man's sheep? And then Nathan says, you, David, are the rich shepherd. You have violated God's law. You are in the wrong. And as punishment, God will take away your son or your child with Bathsheba. And that's what happens. And David goes into mourning, okay? He is distraught, he's depressed. And he writes a lot of poetry. Okay, so this is a very powerful story. And this is a story that has captured the imagination of everyone for thousands of years. But it's complete Spin. This is not what happened. Okay? How do we know? Okay. First thing is this. Nathan says to David, you have stolen a man's you have stolen a man's wife. Therefore, you're in the wrong. What's the problem with this logic? What is David's crime? Real crime. Guys, he killed Uriah. Right? You understand? You've forgotten this fact. He had Uriah killed. That's the real crime. He killed Uriah. Yeah, he slept with Bathsheba. That's bad. But it's much worse if you murder someone, okay? So another question then is, why would he murder Uriah? Why not just talk to him honestly and says, Uriah, I'm sorry, I love your wife. I had sex with her. I'm sorry. Why did David have to get Uriah killed? Why was Uriah killed?
Uriah has the army.
Yeah, because the army is loyal to Uriah, right? So why would David fear Uriah? Because Uriah is a popular, brave soldier, just like David. And David used his popularity in order to usurp the throne from Saul, right? Therefore, David thinks Uriah could do the same thing to me. Therefore, I have to get him killed. In other words, this Bathsheba thing must have come later to disguise the fact that David killed Uriah because he feared Uriah's popularity. Does that make sense? Right? You see how clever this story is? The historical truth must have been David feared Uriah's popularity. And he needed to get rid of Uriah. So he concocted this plan. And then, after he killed Uriah, he needed to explain to his army, okay, who loved Uriah, why this happened. And then David's like, oh, because I fell in love with his wife. I couldn't control myself. I'm just a man. Okay? God is God. I'm a man. I'm a king. I can't be God. I can't control my emotions. Right? Does that make sense? But the irony of this is because David is working so hard to disguise his ruthlessness, he's creating very powerful literature. He created a very powerful story that has captured the imagination of readers for a long time. And you think about it, you think a lot about the story, it unleashes a lot of ideas in you. Okay? You have to ask yourself, what is man? What is God? Are we capable of controlling our emotions? So in other words, this story is extremely well constructed that inspires you to imagine your own personal and emotional and moral life. We call this literature. Right? So, guys, it's no coincidence that today the Jewish people are the most creative people in the world. When you go to America for university, most of your professors are Jewish. Most of the best thinkers in the world are Jewish. These past 200 years, there have been 3 revolutionary thinkers. Karl Marx, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud. They're all Jewish. Who have been raised in the Jewish tradition of asking deep questions about what it means to be human. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about this?
So why would people at that time believe like the apology of David?
Okay, that's a great question, okay? So the question is, why would people believe this apology of David? And, well, the answer is most didn't believe the apology of David, okay? Most were very clear about David's ambitions. But when you're king, you need to impose your reality on others, okay? So this is why this is written. And so it was written for people who were part of David's political coalition. Do you understand? His enemies wouldn't believe this, right? But it was basically meant to appease or convince those who want to believe David. Does that make sense? Okay, spin. And it happens today, guys. When you watch the news, it's spin. Right? It's distorting reality. And so most people will believe the media, right? There are some people who will never believe the media. Like, I don't believe anything the media tells me, whether it's Chinese media or American media. I know a lot of history to understand the media is distorting reality. Okay? But most people will believe this because they have absolutely no interest in not believing it. Right? David's king. If you don't believe it, then you have to believe your king is a murderer. Okay? Does it make sense? Yeah, Echo?
What's the mainstream understanding of this story?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Okay, this is really important. What's the mainstream understanding of the story? So the mainstream understanding of the story is it has to be true. Why? Because it puts David in a bad light. Do you understand? And it shows the genius of David because David is wrestling with his own morality. David is being honest. Right? So the mainstream understanding is David is a poet king. He's a man who prays constantly and engages in a process of self-reflection. And that's what makes David great. Okay? He's constantly praying to God. In fact, the Bible just goes on endlessly about this, how David is constantly in communication with God. And in this communication, he's praying and asking for light, for truth in his own weaknesses, okay? To be delivered from his failings as a man. And the Bathsheba story is emblematic about this, because why would a man make this up, right? Well, I've told you why, but most scholars don't see that. Most scholars think, okay, well, this Bathsheba story puts David in the worst possible light, therefore it must be true, and therefore it shows us David is a poet king who is constantly thinking about his own moral failings. And so he's an inspiration to his people. Okay? That's the mainstream understanding. Oh, okay. So the question is, if people at that time were mainly illiterate, why was this written down? Or how would they know the story? Okay. So the idea is this. First of all, this was written for the elite, for the people around David, to know what story to tell people. Does that make sense? Okay. This was for internal consumption. And this was to basically preserve David's historical legacy. So maybe 20 years from now, when everyone's dead, when people who knew Uriah and Bathsheba were dead, well, what is truth now? The truth is what's been written down, okay? That's why they're saying history is written by the writers. Right? History is not written by the winners. History is written by the writers. All right? Okay, great. So next class, we'll continue the Hebrew Bible, okay? Because it starts off as an apology for David, but it evolves into a much larger mythology. Right? So that's next class.